Welcome back to The Explainer. So today we're diving straight into a literary and historical breakdown of an incredibly intense, raw piece of human emotion. We're dissecting Psalm 44. When most of us think of ancient religious poetry or the Psalms, we usually picture these serene meditations, quiet pastures, and peaceful comfort. But that is absolutely not the full picture. Today, we're looking at the anatomy of a lament, a text that directly wrestles with the deepest, darkest, most confusing moments of the human experience. I mean, listen to this opening shot right out of the gate. Awake! Why are you sleeping, O Lord? What's so fascinating here is how entirely this disrupts our expectations. This isn't some polite, quiet prayer. No way. This is a desperate, borderline accusatory scream for help. The author is literally yelling at the divine to wake up. It sets the stage for a text that is unflinchingly honest about suffering. So, to understand exactly how the writer gets to this explosive point, we've got to look at the brilliant structure of the poem itself. And that structure kicks off in section 1, which covers the first 8 verses, Echoes of Past Glories. This follows a classic arc for ancient laments. Before you can complain about your present circumstances, you kind of have to lay down the baseline, establishing a foundation of sweeping praise and historical memory to show what the relationship was actually supposed to look like. If you read the very top of the text in the English Standard Version, before the verses even begin, there's this super intriguing heading, "To the Troymaster, a Maskil of the sons of Korah." Right away, that tells us this wasn't just a private diary entry written by someone alone in their room. Actually, if you dig into the footnotes, maskil is defined as probably a musical or liturgical term, and that's absolutely crucial. It means this text was specifically designed to be performed, likely sung collectively by a community right in the middle of a massive crisis. Imagine an entire crowd of people standing together, voicing this profound shared trauma as one. It's a highly structured, communal processing of grief. And when that community begins to sing, they kick things off with a triumphant past. The language in these first 8 verses is incredibly confident. They talk about how God drove out the nations. Verse 3 specifically notes that it was not by their own sword that they won the land, but through divine intervention. And verse 5 declares, "Through you we pushed down our foes." They're recounting these massive historical victories, but they are super careful to attribute all of that success entirely to the divine, completely downplaying their own military might. They're basically saying, hey, you did all of this for our ancestors. So this boasting just builds and builds until verse 8, which ends on this incredible high note, "We will give thanks to your name forever." And then we hit this word, Selah. It's a term most scholars understand to mark a pause or a musical interlude. So just imagine the music swelling, hitting this huge triumphant crescendo, and then a dramatic, heavy pause. It's that deep breath right before the emotional floor completely drops out from under the listener. Because after that pause, we crash right into section 2, a crushing present reality, covering verses 9 through 16. Man, the text takes a sudden, incredibly dark turn here. All those sweeping historical victories just vanish, and we are slammed face first into the absolute devastation of an unfolding crisis. It brilliantly illustrates this brutal emotional whiplash. Literally just moments ago in verse 5, the community was singing, "Through you we push down our foes," but jump down to verse 10, and it abruptly flips. "You have made us turn back from the foe." The structural contrast there is totally intentional and completely devastating. The very source of their past victories is now identified as the architect of their present, humiliating defeat. To really drive this home, the psalmist uses some incredibly visceral metaphors to describe the community's utter ruin. They say they're like sheep for slaughter. In verse 12, they cry out, "You have sold your people for a trifle, demanding no high price for them." Just think about the heavy emotional weight of that phrasing. They don't just feel defeated, they feel worthless, discarded, liquidated in some divine bargain bin. They call themselves the taunt of our neighbors. And it gets even more specific. Verse 14 says they have become a laughingstock among the peoples. But if we check the footnotes again, the original Hebrew for that phrase literally translates to a shaking of the head. It's such a physical, evocative detail. You can just picture the surrounding nations looking at this ruined community, physically shaking their heads in a mix of pity, mockery, and disgust. The shame is absolute and all-consuming. This brings us to section 3, the protest of innocence, spanning verses 17 through 22. Now, historically and literarily speaking, this is arguably the most shocking part of the entire poem. It completely upends how the ancient world usually thought about suffering and tragedy. Listen to this quote from verse 17. All this has come upon us, though we have not forgotten you, and we have not been false to your covenant. This is a massive claim, because back in the ancient world, it was an almost universally accepted assumption that if terrible suffering hit a community, it was a direct punishment. You must have done something wrong to anger the divine. But the author looks that assumption right in the eye and flatly rejects it. The conflict here is super stark. The standard ancient expectation was a really simple equation. Sin leads to defeat. But the reality presented in Psalm 44 creates a huge theological problem. Obedience is leading to innocent suffering. The community is making a totally radical claim here. They're saying, we played by all the rules. We kept our end of the bargain. We did everything exactly right, and we are still being destroyed. In verses 18 and 19, they double down on this defense. They claim, our heart has not turned back, nor have our steps departed from your way. They have been completely loyal. And yet, and listen to the severe language that follows, yet you have broken us in the place of jackals and covered us with the shadow of death. The sheer contrast between their flawless loyalty and this horrific punishment is completely jarring. In fact, by verse 21, the psalmist essentially dares the divine to find any hidden fault in them, pointing out that he knows the secrets of the heart. They are inviting maximum scrutiny because they know, for a fact, they are entirely innocent. And honestly, isn't that a universally relatable feeling? The absolute frustrating agony of going through completely unjust suffering when you know you haven't done a single thing to deserve it. It just pushes the author right over the edge. Which propels us right into the climax of the lament, section 4, the urgent call. We're in the final 4 verses now, and you can feel the pacing of the poetry dramatically speed up. The hushed tones of grief, gone. The steady arguments of innocence, gone. The tone completely shifts to this urgent, frantic, demanding plea for action. The psalmist starts firing off these intense questions. Why do you hide your face? We see in verse 24. And that perfectly captures the agonizing central theme of this whole crisis, divine hiddenness. Because the most painful part of their suffering isn't just the physical defeat. It's the unbearable silence. It's the feeling of total abandonment in their absolute darkest hour. And they don't let up for a second. They follow it immediately with another demanding question. Why do you forget our affliction and oppression? You can literally hear the vocal intensity rising here to match the frantic pace of the ancient author. They're shaking the heavens, demanding to know how their intense suffering can simply be ignored or forgotten by the very power that is supposed to protect them. Because at this point, they have absolutely nothing left. Verse 25 paints this picture of total physical and emotional devastation. Our soul is bowed down to the dust. Our belly clings to the ground. This is a community that has been utterly flattened. They are physically prostrate, exhausted, unable to even stand under the weight of their grief. They've been reduced to dust, which leaves them with exactly one final card to play. And that is the final desperate command of the poem found in verse 26. Rise up, come to our help, redeem us for the sake of your steadfast love. Notice they don't ask politely. It's an imperative. And look at why they demand rescue. It's not because they think they're inherently worthy, but for the sake of your steadfast love. They're holding the divine to its own ancient covenant promises. They're basically saying, rescue us because of who you claim to be. And that's where the text just abruptly ends. There's no neat little bow tying it all together, no comforting voice booming from the clouds. Just an unresolved demand left hanging in the air. This ancient text perfectly captures an enduring human struggle, forcing us to sit in the tension and ask, how do we reconcile deeply held beliefs with the brutal reality of innocent suffering? It's a raw, unapologetically honest question that this 3,000-year-old poem leaves us to ponder even today. I mean, what do you do when you've done everything right and the world still breaks apart?